Orbiting the barren planet Voskar, the orbital trade post designated Sector 11-9 was a blot in space. Ugly, rusting, lawless. It had once served as a logistics port for the Altrian grain convoys, but those days were centuries dead. Now it existed solely as a haven for black market dealers, smugglers, and traffickers of the galaxy's darkest trade, living cargo. Among the nameless decks and stinking heat exhaust tunnels, one chamber was colder than the void outside, cold enough to freeze nerve tissue solid. Sergeant Dax Marlin stepped off the transport with his helmet tucked under one arm, his regulation boots thudding across the grated floor. A former combat medic turned recon specialist, Dax had been assigned to inspect this forgotten installation after intercepted comms revealed hints of something deeply illegal happening here. The Coalition suspected weapon trafficking. He was expecting dirty bombs or banned exoplasma cells. He was not expecting the meat. Down a locked corridor labeled Bioprocessing 3, he passed an unlocked control panel left blinking and idle. Security was lax or arrogant. The farther he moved through the dim-lit walkways, the more the stink hit him. Not just rot, but coolant and protein decay. Finally, he reached the chamber. Inside were dozens of slabs, all arranged with mechanical precision. Each slab held a figure, humanoid, lifeless, locked in cryogenic stasis. Their skin glowed pale under frost. Some bore tags on their feet, marked with pricing codes. Others were half-wrapped in foil, their features exposed as if for display. Some were clearly corpses. Others weren't. Dax's eyes froze on one. She was encased in a unit older than standard grade, her body curled inward as if she'd fallen asleep trying to protect herself. Unlike the others, she had no tag, no ID band. But what struck him wasn't her shape or the color of her skin, which was a pale violet with faint, opalescent streaks. It was the subtle movement in her chest. Breath. Shallow, but still there. He moved closer and wiped a patch of frost from the cryoglass. Her face was smooth, young, eerily serene. Her hair, silver and fine, had frozen in delicate strands across her brow. Whoever she was, she had been placed here as meat. She was meant to be sold and consumed. That someone still alive had been put into this nightmare made Dax's hands curl into fists. He didn't hesitate. He keyed open the unit's lockdown seals and manually engaged emergency thaw. She began to stir even before the vapor hissed out. Her fingers twitched first, then her legs. Her eyelids fluttered violently, as if trapped in a dream she couldn't wake from. Her eyes opened. They were silver, but within them danced a shifting nebula of color, like looking into a living galaxy. The moment their gazes locked, Dax knew he wasn't looking at a victim. He was looking at someone who had been wronged, discarded, and he wasn't leaving without her. The thaw process triggered the emergency generator subroutine, and warning klaxons began to beep lowly, muffled by the fog of condensation. Dax worked fast. He removed the cryocuff from her ankle and pressed a thermal wrap across her spine to draw warmth back into her core. Her body convulsed as blood flow restarted. He caught her before she slid from the slab, wrapping her in his coat. Her frame was light, bones too visible under thin skin, but there was strength hiding there too. She gasped once, then again, as if pulling herself back from drowning. Hey, easy, he said, supporting her against him. You're safe now. Her voice came fractured and whispering. This isn't the birthing halls. Dax frowned. You're not where you're supposed to be. They froze you, sold you. Her breath caught. No, I was supposed to be honored. She tried to sit up, and he helped her. Her limbs were shaky but responsive. He kept his eyes on the door while running his wrist scan across the nearby terminal, copying evidence for the Coalition database. He'd be reporting all of it. Every name, every cargo manifest. You remember your name? He asked. She hesitated. Talis. All right, Talis, he said. I'm Dax. We're getting out of here. She blinked slowly, eyes adjusting. Are you a soldier? Close enough? Did you buy me? The question hit like a slap. Dax shook his head hard. No one owns you. Not now. Not ever. Talis looked down at her own hands, as if uncertain they belonged to her. Her fingers curled and uncurled with slow deliberation. She touched her collarbone, then her ribs. The cryo scarring would fade, but the memory of that cold, of being labeled, frozen, forgotten, would last longer. What did they want with me? She asked softly. Dax looked around at the bodies. Same thing they wanted with the rest. Flesh. For display. For sale. For consumption. She didn't speak for several long seconds. Then you pulled me out? He nodded. Why? He didn't have an answer ready, but he didn't need one. He just said, because I saw you. And she stared at him with something like the beginning of belief. In her. In him. In whatever might come next. The stolen shuttle Dax commandeered rattled as it burst from Sector 11-9's orbital perimeter, systems flashing warnings from half-integrated code and scavenged parts. The hull groaned with age, and the nav core protested every maneuver, but the engines held. Behind him, in the narrow medbay, Talis lay curled under thermal blankets, her skin no longer blue with cryofreeze, but still faintly translucent, a strange shimmer pulsing just beneath the surface like bioluminescence. She had slept for hours, body twitching through cycles of unconscious recalibration. When she finally stirred, her eyes opened slowly, and her first word was not a name or a question. It was, chased. Dax turned from the pilot's chair, his rifle resting beside him. They will be, he said. I left that place burning. The fire he'd set wasn't symbolic. He'd rigged the cold chamber with 2 demolition charges from the backup armory he found near the loading bay. By the time he dragged Talis to the dock, smoke was already spilling into the ventilation shafts. No one stopped them. They were too busy running. You shouldn't have done that, she whispered. They don't forget. They don't forgive. I don't need them to forgive me, Dax said. I just need to stay alive long enough to make them pay. Talis tried to sit up, wincing as her spine protested. You don't know who they were, the ones who sold me. They're not slavers, not in the way you understand. I don't care what titles they wear. They called themselves the curators. Dax frowned. Never heard of them. They harvest the rarest flesh in the galaxy, she said, her voice steadier now. For preservation. For preservation. I wasn't meant to be consumed. I was meant to be posed, sealed in crystal, and shown to creatures who want to see what extinction looks like. The bile rose in Dax's throat. Why you? He asked. What makes you rare? Talis hesitated. I wasn't born the way others are. My kind. We're not a species anymore. We're a memory. I was the last descendant of a people engineered for light, for resonance. Dax didn't understand all of it, but he understood enough. She had been stolen, not for what she could do, but for what she represented. Beauty, rarity, the ultimate prize for collectors of death. Well, he said, adjusting course toward a relay point near the Bractos drift, they lost their prize, and I'm not giving her back. She looked at him again, truly looked, and he saw a flicker of something deep behind her eyes. Not trust, not yet, but the shape of it. And when she fell asleep again, this time it was without trembling. The signal came 3 days later. Dax had just finished rerouting the coolant feeds when the console lit up. An encrypted frequency, non-coalition, highly localized, bleeding static through tightly wound code. He recognized the format. Military, but old, modified. He played the message. A single sentence repeated in 10 languages. Return the marked unit or face retrieval protocol. There was no name, no designation, but attached was a glyph, spiraling, organic, sickening to look at directly. The curators had found them. Dax shut the console off. When he turned, Talis was standing behind him, arms wrapped around herself. She had discarded the medical blankets for one of his loose shirts, the sleeves still far too long for her narrow frame. They're tracking the signature of the pod, she said. Not me. They etched a quantum marker into the casing. If we don't jettison it, I already did, Dax said. Scrapped it on the first rock we passed. She exhaled, relief trembling through her body like heat off ice. Then she stepped forward. I can't repay you, she said. Not in any way that would make sense to you. I'm not looking for payment. She tilted her head. Then why did you stay? Why are you still here? He didn't answer right away. I was in a siege once, he said finally. 2 years back. 78 civilians buried under a collapsed station. We pulled out 77. Talis stared at him, unmoving. The one we left behind? He continued. She looked at me right before the ceiling dropped. I promised I'd come back. But I didn't, couldn't. He looked up at her. I couldn't leave someone again. Not this time, not like that. Something cracked in her expression. Her eyes softened, her posture loosened. Then, without warning, she moved forward and wrapped her arms around him. He stiffened for half a heartbeat, startled. Then, slowly, he let his arms return the gesture. Her skin was warm now, her heartbeat steady. And in the silence of the cabin, with the stars drifting endlessly outside, Dax realized he wasn't just protecting a survivor. He was choosing her. And maybe she was beginning to choose him too. The station was called Hoveris 8, a defunct listening post floating dead in the Goldreach system, long since decommissioned and stripped of its beacon. It wasn't on any current coalition maps, only the ones old soldiers like Dax still kept in encrypted drives buried under decades of silence and memory. He landed the shuttle in the lower docking ring, guiding it in with skill honed through 1,000 combat insertions. The station's systems flickered to life as he jacked in the core cable. Still responsive, still hiding in plain sight. Talis stood at the viewport of the mess deck, watching distant starlight twinkle against the hull of a shattered moon. Her arms were folded, her shoulders still tense. She hadn't said much since they left the drift routes. The warning from the curators hadn't been idle. It was a mark, a blood brand. Wherever they stopped now, they carried danger with them. "You've been quiet," Dax said as he approached, holding 2 mugs of synth-caf. He passed her one. She held it delicately, as if warmth itself were still a foreign thing. "I remember this place," she said. "Not this station, but the feeling. Abandoned, dim, cold. Figured it'd be safe, off the networks." She nodded. "It is, but safe doesn't mean silent." He let that sit for a moment. "What did they do to you?" he asked gently. Her gaze stayed on the stars. "You've seen how I look. What I am. The curators don't harvest skin or bone, they harvest essence, thought, identity. They pull memories from their captives and distill them into vials of experience. They don't want you to die, they want you to fade." Dax's jaw tightened. Why? Because their clients are ancient, so old they've forgotten sensation. They buy our memories to feel again. Her voice was bitter now, rough at the edges. They would have pulled my voice apart, my mind, bottled my name in a crystal vial and sold it for 1,000 years of pain and poetry. Dax couldn't stop the anger that surged through him. He'd known monsters. He'd seen wars, insurgents, planetary slavers, but never anything that twisted identity into currency with such elegant cruelty. "You're not a commodity," he said. "No," she whispered, setting the mug down. "I'm a weapon now." She turned to him then, and he saw the fire in her eyes. Not anger. Resolve. "I want to end them." Dax stared at her. "That means going back, all the way to their origin base. That place is a fortress. I don't care. I want them to know what it's like to be seen before they die." He nodded. "Then we take the fight to them." Talis took a slow breath, then did something she hadn't yet done since he pulled her from cryo. She reached for his hand, and he let her take it. The plan was madness. But madness was what Dax knew best. He'd faced artillery nests with no armor support. He'd walked into hostage rings with nothing but a sidearm and a wounded comrade on his back. Compared to those missions, breaking into the curator's relay chamber seemed almost manageable, if suicide could be called manageable. They traced a transmission to a deep space signal repeater on the edge of the Verna Cliffs, a gravity well that served as both hiding place and punishment. Few ships dared it. Too many disappeared. But the curators had no fear of loss. They only feared exposure. The repeater was buried inside the field, and Talis had decoded enough of their encryption to know it was the first relay that received her original cryo signal. They reached it in silence. The repeater itself wasn't guarded, not physically, but as soon as Dax bypassed the first seal, a pulse shot out. He felt it vibrate through his jawbone, a shiver down the spine. "They know," he said. Talis was already at the core console, her fingers dancing across the ancient key set. "Good." Dax turned to face the hallway. Lights flickered. "Time? 2 minutes before they can transmit a reply," she said. Dax took up a defensive position by the door. "Make it 1. It wasn't long before the first drone arrived. It didn't look like a machine. It looked like a glass sculpture floating with soundless menace, a mirrored orb with long filament legs that crackled with static charge. It skittered through the corridor as if the station's geometry bent for it. Dax fired once, twice. The first shot rebounded off the field it projected. The second, a plasma burst, hit true. The drone exploded with a scream that wasn't mechanical. Talis didn't flinch. 30 seconds. Another came. 2. Then 4. Dax fought like a man with something left to live for. He moved with fluid violence, conserving ammo, anticipating the flicker of each drone's next step. His focus narrowed until only the space between him and the next threat existed. "Until done," Talis called. She pulled a drive from the port, turned to him. Her cheeks were flushed with heat, her breath quickened. "What now?" she asked. "We run." They didn't make it to the shuttle unscathed. One of the drones clipped Dax across the ribs with a beam that sizzled like acid, melting armor into skin. But he got her out. He always got her out. Inside the ship, bleeding but alive, he watched her slide the drive into the nav computer. "I downloaded everything," she said. "Locations, names, clients, the whole chain." Dax stared at her, breath ragged. "You're serious?" She looked down at his injured side, at the blood pooling in his armor. "They made me a trophy," she said. "Now I make them a target." And as their ship jumped into slipstream, trailing sparks behind its battered hull, Dax felt something strange settle in his chest. Not vengeance, but faith. Faith in the woman he had rescued from ice, and in the fire she now carried for them both. They arrived at the edge of the Dimerax Veil, a swath of space where light thinned and time dragged, known to smugglers and assassins as the place where secrets were buried. Talis stood at the console, her hands flying across the nav table with an ease Dax had come to rely on. She'd spent every waking hour since the repeater extraction parsing the data from the drive, decrypting it line by line, hunting the one node that mattered. The archive. The term came up again and again in the stolen files. Not a vault, not a fortress, a living repository operated by the curators, where memories and essences of thousands were processed and distilled. According to Talis, it floated inside the core of a starless nebula, a station shrouded by gravitational chaos, locked in by tides that stripped signal and sanity alike. She didn't blink when she found it. Dax did. "It's suicide," he muttered, staring at the readings. "Even if we breach orbit, no ship comes out again. The nebula eats navigation. Ion scrambles everything. Unless," she said, "you were designed for it." Dax looked up. Talis met his gaze. "They built the archive around me. I remember the mathematics. I can guide you in. But once we land, there's no turning back. If we fail, we vanish." He didn't hesitate. "Then we don't fail." They loaded up in silence. Dax checked the charges, rebalanced the shielding, and took 2 syringes of synth stims. Talis adjusted the sensory dampeners to keep their minds from frying on entry. As they dropped into the dark, the stars blinked out like candles snuffed by wind. Only the archive's signal remained, a pulsing frequency embedded in every memory they'd stolen. The ship's hull groaned as the nebula took hold. Systems flickered. Sound vanished. Then light returned, in the form of a structure that shimmered like obsidian and bone, alive and vast. No windows, no hangars, no entrance marked. But Talis knew. Vector 542, adjust yaw, engage mag clamps. They landed on what seemed to be a vein of the structure. A panel peeled open, revealing a corridor like the inside of a mind. Soft, whispering, filled with echoes of screams and songs long stolen. They entered together. Inside, the archive was less a place and more a presence. Voices pulsed in the walls, memories rippled like oil over glass. Dax felt them trying to claw into him, half-formed thoughts begging to be remembered, forgotten lovers, dying children, betrayals that would never find redemption. He stumbled, but Talis steadied him. "They're not real," she said. "They're not ours." He nodded, teeth clenched. "Let's finish this." They reached the core, a cathedral of thought where frozen shards of lives floated in orbits, drifting in concentric rings around a glowing central node. And in that node pulsed a signature Dax recognized too well. Talis. "It's you," he breathed. "It was all me," she said. "Every part they couldn't control, they stored. They copied my thoughts and left only the shell behind." He looked at her, then at the explosives in his bag. "No," she said. "This isn't a place we destroy with fire." Her hands moved, her voice shifted, deepened. No longer just hers, but layered with the resonance of something ancient and raw. The walls responded. The node pulsed, and the archive began to come undone. The curators had prepared for everything except rebellion from within. As Talis sang, not in melody, but in the language of energy that echoed through the core itself, the structure screamed. Lights burst, pressure rippled, the stolen lives were released, disintegrating into radiant streaks that spun free into the void. But the archive wasn't defenseless. A figure emerged from the shadows, not a guard, but something more, a curator prime, no longer flesh, more machine than mind. It towered, elegant and grotesque, its face a shifting mask of memories it had stolen. It spoke with a chorus of voices. You were made to be kept, not awakened. Talis stood her ground. I was made to carry the light of those you silenced. Dax raised his rifle. Back off. You are nothing, the Prime sneered. A violent relic from a dying species. Maybe, Dax said, but I'm hers. He fired. The bolt struck true, but the creature shifted, absorbing the blast with a shimmer of stolen thought. It lunged, but Dax met it head-on, slamming into it with everything he had. It wasn't about strength. It was about will. And his was forged in fire. Talis reached the node as Dax struggled with the Prime. She placed her hands on the core. For the forgotten, she whispered. Energy surged. The node exploded in light. The archive began to collapse. The Prime shrieked, unraveling, its body losing cohesion as the memories it hoarded turned against it, voices crying out, not in pain, but in revolt. Dax was thrown back and Talis caught him, dragging him toward the exit as the walls caved inward. They reached the shuttle with seconds to spare. The blast from the archive's death sent ripples across the nebula, but the force cleared the exit vector. They escaped into the dark. No longer hunted. No longer alone. As the ship sailed through the remnants of the nebula, Dax sat beside her, bloodied but alive. She looked at him. You stayed. He reached for her hand. Always. Outside, the last light of the archive faded, and in its place silence returned. But not the silence of cages. The silence of peace. They drifted for 3 days, not because they were lost, but because there was nowhere they wanted to be just yet. The ship moved under silent power, its damaged systems patched and holding, while the great scar of the Dimerax Nebula slowly receded into memory. What remained of the archive now glowed faintly in the starless dark, a field of dust and photons, scattered memories returning to the ether. Talis sat near the aft window, her knees drawn to her chest, the hum of the ship's drive singing softly behind her. She was quiet, not distant. Her face had changed since the archive. The tension in her jaw was gone, her gaze more grounded, not softened but reclaimed. What had once been stolen was now hers again, not just her body, not just her mind, but her name. Spoken now without chains, lived without permission. Dax found her there, same as always, silently letting her keep the silence if she needed it. He lowered himself beside her, his body still sore from the impact, his ribs wrapped in synth weave, his hands still scarred from the fight. You haven't said much, he murmured. There's a difference between quiet and empty, she replied. I was empty once, now I'm just listening. He nodded. To what? To the parts of me they buried, the voices I thought were gone. She turned her head, silver hair falling across her cheek. I remember things now, not just my people, my home. I remember how the sun rose over the glass hills. I remember the taste of cloud fruit. I remember the song my sister sang when she was scared. Her eyes shined, not with tears, but with awe. They couldn't kill that, not all of it. Dax reached over slowly. She let him take her hand. You did more than survive, he said. You carried something they never understood. They thought you were a trophy, but you're a torch. She looked at him, her fingers tightening around his. I couldn't have done it without you. You could have, he said, but I'm damn glad you didn't have to. There was a pause, then a smile. I want to go back, she said. Not to the archive, not to vengeance, to the stars, to the places my people once touched. I want to find the ruins, the echoes. Maybe even build something again. Dax chuckled, low and warm. You're asking me to follow you. I'm asking if you already were. He kissed the back of her hand. Yeah, I was. It took another week to reach the system marked in her memories, a small blue-green planet orbiting a sun whose light bent strangely at the edges. She called it Saratal. It had once been the heart of a colony before the wars, before the curators hunted her kind to the brink. Now it was quiet, overgrown, waiting. They landed in the high meadows, their boots sinking into soft moss where old stone walkways lay cracked and buried. Wild trees had overtaken the courtyards. The great crystalline towers were gone, but fragments remained, half-melted glass structures that still caught the sunlight like prisms. Talis stood at the base of one ruin, hands outstretched, breathing deep. This is where I was born, she whispered. Dax stood beside her, the wind catching his jacket. You remember it all? No, she said, smiling, but I remember enough to begin again. They found a still pool nearby and set the first beacon stone, a smooth shard she carved herself from one of the remaining pylons. It hummed when she placed it into the ground, the resonance stirring a faint glow beneath the soil. It was an old tradition among her people, the laying of the first stone. A promise to return. A seed for tomorrow. Dax watched her work, watched her hum to the stone, watched the glow spread in rings. Others might come, he said. I hope they do. They'll want to know what happened to the curators. Talis stood. Let them wonder. She turned to him, taking his hand, walking back toward the ship with her face toward the sky. They didn't look back. They didn't need to. In that silent world beneath the twin moons, a legacy began, not from bloodlines or conquest, but from survival, from defiance, from two hands laying a foundation, not for memory, but for life. Talis and Dax, once prisoner and rescuer, had become something else. Together, they were the future, and the galaxy, whether ready or not, would feel its warmth.